Good evening, and welcome back to the Night Archive. Before we begin tonight's journey into the gaslit world of Victorian England, I would like to ask you to leave a comment below with your current time and the city where you are listening from. It has become a small ritual of ours, a way of knowing that across the world, in different time zones and different rooms, we are all settling into the quiet together. Whether it is midnight in London or early morning in Sydney, you are welcome here. Tonight, we will walk through the narrow streets of 19th century Britain, past the soot-stained shop windows and the flickering gas lamps, into a world where the food that people ate was slowly killing them. We will stand before the sweet shop counter, where children pressed their faces against the glass, pointing at brightly colored candies that contained arsenic and lead. We will enter the bakery, where the bread that fed working families was stretched with chalk and alum and ground bones. We will follow the milkman on his rounds, watching as he watered down his product with water drawn from the same sources that carried sewage and disease. This is the story of Victorian junk food. Not the harmless indulgence we know today, but something far more sinister. A world where profit mattered more than human life, where there were no regulations, no inspections, no consequences for poisoning your customers. A world where a penny sweet could send a child to an early grave, and where the bread of life was, quite literally, the bread of death. The Victorian age is often remembered for its grand achievements. The expansion of empire, the growth of industry, the march of progress. But beneath the surface of that glittering era lay a darkness that touched every kitchen table and every hungry mouth. The food supply of the world's most powerful nation was thoroughly, systematically, and almost universally corrupted. What makes this story so haunting is not the malice of individual villains, though there were certainly those who knew exactly what they were doing. It is the sheer ordinariness of the corruption. Bakers adulterated their bread because everyone else did. Grocers sold fake tea because their customers could not afford the real thing. Sweet makers used toxic dyes because they made the candies pretty, and pretty candies sold better. It was a system built on small compromises and quiet cruelties, and the people who suffered most were those who could least afford to protect themselves. The poor ate the worst food. The children ate the brightest sweets, and the bodies piled up in ways that were never properly counted, because who would bother to investigate when a slum child died of convulsions, or when a factory worker's wife wasted away from some mysterious ailment? These deaths were not dramatic. They were slow, quiet, and invisible. They happened in cramped rooms and narrow beds, far from the attention of those who might have cared not. So tonight, let us remember them. Let us walk through the sweet shops and the bakeries, the dairies, and the public houses, and let us see what the Victorians saw, or rather what they chose not to see. Let us understand how an entire society could poison itself in the pursuit of profit and convenience. And let us consider what lessons, if any, we have learned. The gas lamps are lit. The shop doors are open. The penny sweets are waiting in their jars. Let us begin to understand how Victorian food became so dangerous. We must first understand the world that created it. The 19th century was an age of transformation, of cities growing faster than anyone could have imagined, of populations swelling beyond the capacity of traditional food systems to feed them. In 1801, the population of England and Wales was approximately 9 million. By 1901, it had grown to over 32 million, and most of that growth was concentrated in the cities, those vast, hungry, smoking engines of industry that drew people from the countryside with promises of work and wages. London alone grew from roughly 1 million inhabitants at the start of the century to over 6 million by its end. Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Leeds. All of these cities expanded at rates that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. And all of these people needed to eat. The old systems of food production and distribution were simply not designed for this scale. In a village, you knew your baker. You knew where your milk came from. You could see the fields where your grain was grown and the cows that provided your butter. But in the city, food came from somewhere else, from anonymous sources, through chains of middlemen and wholesalers and retailers, each of whom had opportunities to tamper with the product before it reached your table. The distance between producer and consumer created a veil of ignorance that unscrupulous traders were quick to exploit. If you bought tea from a grocer in Manchester, how would you know whether those dried leaves had ever seen a tea plant? If you purchased bread from a baker in London, how could you tell whether the flour had been stretched with cheaper substances? The answer, for most consumers, was that you could not know. You simply had to trust. And trust, in the Victorian marketplace, was a commodity in desperately short supply. The problem was not new. Food adulteration had existed for centuries, and complaints about dishonest traders can be found in records going back to medieval times. But the Industrial Revolution transformed the scale and sophistication of the fraud. What had once been the occasional crime of individual bad actors became a systematic feature of the entire food industry. Adulteration was not the exception. It was the rule. The reasons were primarily economic. Competition among food sellers was fierce, and prices were driven down to levels where honest trading became almost impossible. If your competitor was stretching his flour with chalk and selling bread at a penny less than yours, you had a choice. You could maintain your standards and watch your customers walk away, or you could do as your competitor did and stay in business. Most chose to stay in business. It was also the matter of appearance. Victorian consumers, like consumers in any age, bought with their eyes. They wanted their bread to be white, their butter to be yellow, their tea to be dark, their sweets to be brightly colored. These visual expectations created incentives for traders to enhance the appearance of their products, and the chemicals that achieved these effects were often toxic. White bread was more desirable than brown bread, a preference that reflected class anxieties as much as taste. The wealthy ate white bread, so white bread was what everyone aspired to. But truly white flour was expensive, and the bread made from cheaper flour tended toward gray or brown. The solution was alum, a chemical compound that whitened bread and also helped it retain water, making the loaves heavier and thus more profitable. Alum was not immediately lethal, but consumed regularly, it caused digestive problems and contributed to malnutrition by interfering with the absorption of nutrients. Yellow butter was more appealing than pale butter, so dairymen added coloring agents to make their product look richer. Sometimes these agents were harmless, like carrot juice or marigold petals, but sometimes they were not. Lead chromate, a bright yellow compound, was cheap and effective, and it was also poisonous. The logic of adulteration was relentless. Every product in the Victorian marketplace was subject to it. Every link in the supply chain offered opportunities for fraud. And the consumers, especially the poor consumers who could not afford to be choosy, had no way to protect themselves. There were no food safety laws worthy of the name. There were no government inspectors. There were no required labels listing ingredients. It was only the marketplace, and the marketplace rewarded those who cut corners and punished those who did not. This was the world into which the Victorian child walked when they entered the sweet shop, coins clutched in hand, eyes wide at the colors and shapes behind the glass. They did not know, could not know, that the beautiful red of those candies came from lead, or that the bright green was colored with copper arsenite. They only knew that the sweets were pretty, and that they cost a penny, and that they tasted sweet. The age of adulteration was not an accident. It was not a failure of the system. It was the system, working exactly as economic incentives dictated. And the cost of that system was measured in human lives, most of them young, most of them poor, most of them forgotten not. Let us begin where the youngest victims were found, at the sweet shop counter. The Victorian sweet shop was a place of wonder for children. The jars lined up on shelves, each filled with candies of different colors and shapes. Red lozenges and yellow drops, green sticks and white comfits, striped humbugs and glossy bull's eyes. For a penny or a halfpenny, a child could walk away with a small paper bag of treasures, something to suck on slowly through the afternoon, a rare luxury in lives that offered few luxuries. Sweet shops existed in every neighborhood, from the prosperous suburbs to the poorest slums. In the working-class districts, they were often run from the front rooms of private houses by widows or elderly women who needed the income. The sweets themselves came from small manufacturers, many of them operating from cramped workshops with no oversight and no regulation. The economics of the penny sweet trade demanded cheapness above all else. A child's penny had to buy a satisfying quantity of candy, which meant the manufacturer had to produce those sweets at the lowest possible cost. Sugar was expensive. Labor was cheap, but not free. The only way to increase profits was to reduce the cost of ingredients, and the easiest way to reduce costs was to use substitutes. Chalk was added to whiten candies and increase their bulk. Plaster of Paris served the same purpose. These additions were fraudulent, but not immediately harmful. The body would simply pass them through, gaining no nutrition, but suffering no obvious damage. But the colors were a different matter entirely. Victorian consumers expected their sweets to be brightly colored. A plain white or cream-colored candy was less appealing than one that glowed red or green or yellow. And the cheapest way to achieve those vivid colors was through mineral pigments, many of which were highly toxic. Red candies were often colored with red lead, a compound of lead oxide that had been used as a pigment since ancient times. It produced a beautiful scarlet color. It was cheap, and it was poisonous. Lead accumulates in the body over time, causing damage to the nervous system, the kidneys, and the brain. In children, whose bodies are smaller and whose organs are still developing, the effects were particularly severe. Chronic lead poisoning caused abdominal pain, constipation, fatigue, irritability, and developmental delays. In high doses, it caused convulsions and death. Green candies were colored with copper arsenite, also known as Scheele's green or Paris green. This compound produced a brilliant emerald color that was irresistible to Victorian eyes. It was also a compound of arsenic, one of the most notorious poisons in history. Arsenic poisoning caused vomiting, diarrhea, and severe abdominal pain. Chronic exposure led to skin lesions, nerve damage, and cancer. Acute exposure could kill within hours. Yellow candies often contained lead chromate, known as chrome yellow. This pigment was popular because of its bright, sunny color, and it was used not only in candies, but in a wide range of consumer products. It was also a compound of both lead and chromium, both of which are toxic. The manufacturers knew, or should have known, that these substances were dangerous. The toxicity of lead had been recognized since Roman times. The dangers of arsenic were well established. But the sweet makers continued to use these compounds because they were cheap, because they produced attractive colors, and because there was no one to stop them. The most notorious incident of sweet poisoning occurred in Bradford in 1858. A sweet maker named Joseph Neal purchased what he believed to be daft, a term used for the plaster of Paris, or gypsum, commonly used to bulk out cheap candies. But the substance he received was not daft. It was arsenic trioxide, white arsenic, purchased by mistake from a druggist's shop where it had been stored, alongside the legitimate adulterant. Neal mixed the arsenic into a batch of peppermint, humbugs, and sold them to a market stall holder named William Hardacre, who was known locally as Humbug Billy. Hardacre sold the sweets at the Green Market in Bradford on the Saturday evening of October 30, 1858. By Sunday morning, people were dying. The first victim was a child, then another. Then adults began to fall ill. Over the following days, the death toll rose to 21, with more than 200 people sickened. The victims suffered the classic symptoms of arsenic poisoning: violent vomiting, bloody diarrhea, agonizing stomach cramps, and convulsions. Some died within hours. Others lingered for days. That the Bradford sweet poisoning was a sensation. It made headlines across the country and sparked public outrage. How could this happen? How could 21 people die from eating candy? The answer, as investigators soon discovered, was that the systems that should have prevented such a tragedy simply did not exist. There were no controls on what went into food. There were no requirements for safe storage of poisons. There was nothing to stop a druggist from keeping white arsenic next to white chalk, or to stop a sweet maker from using whatever powder he was handed without testing it. Joseph Neal was tried for manslaughter, but acquitted. The jury accepted that he had not known the powder was arsenic. William Hardacre was also acquitted. The druggist, Charles Hodgson, from whose shop the arsenic had come, was not even charged. No one was held accountable for 21 deaths. The Bradford poisoning was an extreme case, a mass casualty event that could not be ignored. But it was only the most visible example of a much larger problem. Children across Britain were being slowly poisoned by the sweets they ate, 1 penny at a time, and no one was counting those quiet deaths. Bread was the foundation of the Victorian diet. For the working classes, it was often the only substantial food they ate. A laborer might consume a pound or more of bread each day, supplemented perhaps by a little cheese, a little beer, some potatoes when they could be afforded. For the poorest families, bread was not a supplement to the diet. It was the diet. This centrality of bread to survival made its adulteration particularly cruel. If your sweets were poisoned, you might suffer. If your bread was poisoned, you would surely suffer, because you ate it at every meal, day after day, year after year. The adulteration of bread was ancient and widespread. Bakers had been adding substances to their flour for centuries, stretching the expensive wheat with cheaper additions, whitening the gray flour with chemical agents, increasing the water content to make heavier loaves. But the Victorian period saw this practice reach industrial scales. The most common adulterant was alum, a compound of aluminum and potassium that had multiple useful properties for the dishonest baker. Alum whitened bread, making cheap flour look like expensive flour. It improved the texture, allowing the dough to hold more water and air, and it made the finished loaves heavier, which mattered because bread was sold by weight. A baker who used alum could produce loaves that looked whiter, felt softer, and weighed more than loaves made from unadulterated flour. He could charge the same price and pocket the difference, or he could undercut his competitors and drive them out of business. The quantities of alum used were significant. Investigators found that some bakers were adding up to several ounces of alum per sack of flour. Consumers were eating this substance daily in amounts that accumulated over time. Alum was not immediately lethal, but it was not harmless. It caused digestive irritation and could exacerbate conditions like ulcers. More significantly, it interfered with the absorption of nutrients from food. People who ate alum-laden bread were getting less nutrition from everything else they ate. In a population already living on the edge of malnutrition, this interference could make the difference between surviving the winter and not surviving it. But alum was only the beginning. The flour itself was often adulterated before it even reached the baker. Millers added ground chalk to increase the weight and whiteness of their flour. They added ground bones, collected from slaughterhouses and knackers' yards, and processed into a fine white powder. They added sawdust. They added plaster. An analysis conducted by Arthur Hill, Hazal in the 1850s, found that the majority of bread samples he tested contained foreign substances. Some samples contained all of the adulterants mentioned above. The bread that working families were eating was not really bread at all. It was a mixture of flour and whatever else the miller and the baker had decided to add. The chalk and plaster were relatively inert, passing through the body without causing direct harm. But they provided no nutrition. A family buying a 4-pound loaf might be getting only 3 pounds of actual food, the rest being worthless filler. They were paying bread prices for chalk. The bone meal was more troubling. The bones used came from various sources, and their processing was not always thorough. There were concerns that some of the bone meal came from diseased animals, or from human remains collected from graveyards and battlefields. These fears may have been exaggerated, but they were not entirely baseless. The bone trade was murky, and no one was checking the origins of the raw materials. There were also additives meant to disguise the use of spoiled flour. Flour that had gone stale or rancid could be treated with chemicals to mask the taste and smell. Copper sulfate was sometimes used for this purpose, adding a faintly metallic taste that consumers learned to accept as normal. The bakers themselves were often caught in the same economic trap as other food sellers. They bought their flour from millers who had already adulterated it, and they added their own adulterants to compete with other bakers who were doing the same. A baker who tried to sell honest bread at honest prices would quickly find himself without customers because his loaves would be darker, denser, and more expensive than those of his competitors. The system was self-reinforcing. Everyone adulterated because everyone else adulterated. The honest trader was punished, the dishonest trader was rewarded, and the consuming public had no way to tell the difference. This was the bread of life that Victorian families depended on. This was the daily bread for which they prayed. It was not bread at all. not in any meaningful sense. It was a commercial product designed to maximize profit at the expense of nutrition and health, and the people who ate it were slowly being starved and poisoned at the same time. Every morning before dawn, the milk carts would begin their rounds through the streets of Victorian cities. The milkman was a familiar figure, calling out his wares, ladling milk from his churns into the jugs and pails that housewives brought to their doorsteps. "Fresh milk," he would cry. Sweet and pure dot, it was rarely either. The milk trade in Victorian Britain was perhaps the most thoroughly corrupted of all food industries. The journey from cow to consumer offered so many opportunities for adulteration that by the time milk reached the city kitchen, it might contain more water than milk, along with a variety of additives designed to disguise the dilution. The problems began at the farms. Dairy cattle in the mid-19th century were often kept in appalling conditions, crowded into urban dairies where they never saw grass or sunlight. These town cows, as they were called, were fed on spent grain from breweries and distilleries, a diet that was cheap, but that produced thin, bluish milk of poor quality. The cows themselves were frequently diseased, suffering from tuberculosis and other conditions that could be transmitted through their milk. But even this poor quality milk was too valuable to sell undiluted. The first watering typically happened at the farm, where dairymen added water to increase the volume of milk they had to sell. The water used was whatever was available, and in many cases, this meant water from ponds, ditches, or wells that were contaminated with sewage. The milk then passed to wholesalers and distributors, each of whom took their own share of profit by adding more water. By the time the milk reached the retail milkman, it might have been watered 3 or 4 times. The milkman himself would often add water more time before selling to his customers. The result was a product that bore little resemblance to actual milk. It was thin, watery, and grayish-blue in color. It spoiled quickly and tasted unpleasant. Consumers complained, but they had no alternatives. This was the milk that was available, and if you wanted milk, this was what you bought. To make the watered milk look more like real milk, sellers added various substances. Chalk was used to restore the whitish color. Flour or starch thickened the consistency. Boracic acid, a mild preservative, helped prevent spoilage. Some sellers added annatto, a yellow-orange dye, to give the milk a richer, creamier appearance. The most disturbing adulterant was not added intentionally. It was the contamination that came from the water itself. Urban water supplies in Victorian Britain were notoriously polluted, carrying raw sewage, industrial waste, and the runoff from graveyards and slaughterhouses. When this water was added to milk, it brought with it a cargo of bacteria and parasites that could cause serious illness. Milk-borne diseases were a major cause of infant mortality in Victorian cities. Babies who were fed on adulterated milk instead of breast milk died in enormous numbers, succumbing to diarrhea, cholera infantum, and other gastrointestinal diseases. The death rates were highest in the summer months, when bacteria multiplied rapidly in the warm, unrefrigerated milk. One study of infant mortality in Liverpool found that babies fed on cow's milk were several times more likely to die in their first year than babies who were breastfed. The difference was almost entirely due to the quality of the milk, which was contaminated with fecal bacteria and diluted with polluted water that the mothers who fed their babies. This milk did not know they were poisoning them. They believed they were providing nourishment. supplementing or replacing breast milk that for various reasons they could not provide themselves. Many of these mothers were working women, factory hands and domestic servants who could not breastfeed because their jobs kept them away from their infants. They paid for milk in good faith, and they watched their babies die. And they blamed themselves or blamed fate or blamed God, never knowing that the true blame lay with a system that allowed poison to be sold as food got. And milkmen and the dairymen knew what they were doing, or at least they knew they were adding water. Whether they understood the full consequences of their actions is harder to say. They were operating within a system that rewarded adulteration and punished honesty, and they were simply doing what everyone else did. But the children died nonetheless. They died in their thousands, in their tens of thousands, quiet deaths in cramped rooms, recorded in parish registers as cholera infantum or summer diarrhea, or simply as failure to thrive. They were the smallest and most helpless victims of the age of adulteration, and they are the ones we should remember most. Tea was the national drink of Victorian Britain. It was consumed at all levels of society, from the aristocratic drawing room to the factory floor. For the working classes, a cup of tea was one of the few affordable pleasures, a moment of warmth and comfort in lives that offered little of either. Tea was served at every meal, drunk throughout the day, and its preparation was a domestic ritual that marked the rhythm of daily life. The demand for tea was enormous, and the supply was controlled by a handful of large importers who brought the leaves from China and, increasingly, from the tea plantations of India and Ceylon. The tea that reached British shores was generally genuine, though of varying quality. But between the importer's warehouse and the consumer's cup lay a long chain of middlemen, each of whom had opportunities and incentives to tamper with the product. The most common form of tea adulteration was the simplest, mixing expensive tea with cheaper substitutes. Used tea leaves were a significant source of this fraud. Dealers would buy spent leaves from hotels, coffee houses, and wealthy households, dry them, recolor them, and mix them with fresh tea. The resulting product looked like tea, smelled faintly like tea, and could be sold at tea prices, even though much of it had already been brewed once. The recoloring of used tea leaves was a minor industry in itself. The spent leaves were spread out on drying floors, treated with various chemicals to restore their color, and then mixed with fresh leaves or sold on their own to the poorest customers. The chemicals used for this purpose included blacklead, Prussian blue, and various other pigments, some of which were toxic. But used tea leaves were only part of the problem. Sellers also mixed tea with leaves from other plants entirely. Sloe leaves, ash leaves, and elder leaves were commonly used, dried and processed to look as much like tea as possible. These additions were not necessarily harmful, but they were fraudulent. Customers paying for tea were getting something that was not tea. The worst adulterations involved the coloring of fake tea to make it resemble the genuine article. Green tea was particularly subject to this fraud because its appearance was so distinctive. To create fake green tea, counterfeiters would take spent leaves or substitute leaves and coat them with a mixture of Prussian blue and chrome yellow, sometimes with the addition of toxic copper compounds. The resulting product had the vivid green color that consumers expected, but it was poisonous dot Prussian blue, also known as ferric ferrocyanide, was relatively harmless in small quantities. But chrome yellow was lead chromate, the same toxic compound used to color candies. And the copper-based greens were compounds of a metal that accumulates in the liver and causes long-term damage to health. The scale of tea adulteration was staggering. When Arthur Hill Hassel conducted his investigations in the 1850s, he found that a significant proportion of the tea samples he tested had been adulterated in some way. Some contained used leaves. Some contained leaves from other plants. Some had been artificially colored with toxic substances. Very little of what was sold as cheap tea was actually what it claimed to be. The consumers most affected were those who could least afford to be defrauded. Wealthy households bought their tea directly from reputable importers and paid prices that made adulteration unprofitable. But working-class families bought their tea from small shops and street sellers in small quantities, at low prices that could only be achieved through fraud. A factory worker's wife might buy an ounce of tea at a time, stretching it as far as she could, using and reusing the same leaves until they gave no color at all to the water. She did not know that those leaves had already been used before she bought them, or that they had been colored with lead and copper to make them look fresh. She only knew that tea was a comfort and a necessity, and that she paid what she could afford and hoped for the best. The tea she drank was slowly poisoning her, and she had no way of knowing. Beer was the other universal drink of Victorian Britain. For the working classes, it was safer than water, more nourishing than tea, and more affordable than spirits. A pint of beer was a reward at the end of a hard day, a social ritual shared with friends and workmates, a small pleasure that even the poorest could sometimes afford. Asterisk, asterisk, the public house was the center of working class social life. It was where men gathered to drink and talk, to escape the cramped quarters of their homes, to share news and gossip, to conduct informal business and settle disputes. The publican was a figure of some importance in his community, the host and gatekeeper of this essential social space. But the beer he served was often not what it seemed. The adulteration of beer had a long history, and Victorian publicans inherited a tradition of fraud that stretched back centuries. The basic problem was familiar. Competition drove prices down, and adulterators could undercut honest traders. A publican who served genuine beer at fair prices would lose customers to the publican down the street who served watered beer at lower prices. The simplest adulteration was dilution. Water was added to beer to stretch the supply, and then various substances were added to disguise the dilution. Salt was commonly used to restore the beer's body and to make customers thirsty, encouraging them to drink more. Sugar was added for sweetness. Coloring agents were added to restore the rich brown color that consumers expected. But some adulterants were far more sinister than salt and sugar. Cocculus indicus, also known as fishberry, was a plant whose seeds contained a toxic alkaloid called picrotoxin. This substance had a bitter taste that mimicked the bitterness of hops, and it was used by unscrupulous brewers to add bitterness to beer without the expense of actual hops. Picrotoxin is a poison that affects the nervous system, causing nausea, vomiting, convulsions, and in severe cases, death. Strychnine was another bitter substance used to adulterate beer. This notorious poison, derived from the seeds of the Nux vomica tree, was best known as a rat poison and a murder weapon. In small quantities, it produced a bitter taste that some drinkers actually came to prefer, associating it with strong, potent beer. In larger quantities, it killed. Opium was sometimes added to beer to give it an additional kick, a dreamy, sedative quality that kept customers coming back. Tobacco juice was used for similar reasons, adding a harsh edge to the drink that masked its dilution. Copper sulfate was added to improve the color and head of the beer. Lead acetate, known as sugar of lead because of its sweet taste, was occasionally used as a sweetener. Both of these substances were toxic. The effects of these adulterations varied, depending on the substances used and the quantities consumed. A working man who drank a pint or two of mildly adulterated beer might suffer no obvious ill effects, but a heavy drinker who frequented a particularly dishonest public house might be slowly poisoning himself without knowing it. The cumulative effects were difficult to trace. A man who developed digestive problems or tremors or other chronic symptoms would not necessarily connect these to his evening pints. He would blame the hard work or the damp climate or simply the inevitable decline of age. The poison worked slowly and invisibly, and its victims rarely knew what was killing them. The brewing industry itself was divided between large commercial breweries, which produced beer of relatively consistent quality, and small alehouses, which brewed their own or bought from small suppliers and were subject to no oversight. The largest frauds tended to occur at the retail level, where publicans adulterated the beer they had purchased from legitimate brewers. There were occasional prosecutions, usually when the adulteration was particularly egregious, or when a death could be directly attributed to poisoned beer. But these cases were rare, and the penalties were light. The system continued because there was money to be made, and no effective way to stop it. The working men who gathered in the public house each evening, seeking a few hours of warmth and fellowship, were drinking poison along with their beer. They trusted the publican, trusted the familiar taste of their usual pint, and that trust was betrayed every time they raised a glass. Sugar was the foundation of the confectionery trade, and its adulteration was both widespread and particularly harmful. The sweetness that made candies appealing, that made tea drinkable, that made life in the industrial city slightly more bearable, came at a hidden cost that was measured in damaged bodies and shortened lives. Pure cane sugar was expensive. The sugar that reached British shores had traveled thousands of miles from the plantations of the Caribbean, processed through a complex industrial system of refineries and wholesalers before it reached the grocer's shelf. At each stage of this journey, there were opportunities to dilute, adulterate, and defraud. The most common adulterant of sugar was sand. Clean, white sand was mixed with granulated sugar, increasing the volume without adding to the cost. The quantities used were sometimes significant. A housewife might buy a pound of sugar and receive several ounces of sand along with it. The sand passed through the body without causing direct harm, but it provided no sweetness and no calories. The family was being cheated of nourishment they had paid for. Chalk was also used, producing a similar effect. Plaster of Paris appeared in some samples. These mineral adulterants made the sugar gritty and affected its performance in cooking and baking, but they were not poisonous in the conventional sense. More troubling were the colored sugars, particularly the brown and yellow varieties that were used in baking and confectionery. These sugars were sometimes colored with red lead or other metallic pigments to enhance their appearance. The warm, golden brown color that consumers associated with quality was sometimes achieved through the addition of toxic substances. The refining process itself could introduce contaminants. Sugar refineries used various chemicals to clarify and whiten their product, and traces of these chemicals sometimes remained in the finished sugar. Lead was occasionally found in refined sugar, leached from the lead-lined vessels used in processing. For the poorest consumers, there was treacle, the dark, viscous byproduct of sugar refining. Treacle was cheap because it was essentially waste, but it was also susceptible to adulteration. Sand and other fillers were added, and the product was sometimes contaminated with substances from the refining. Processed children were the largest consumers of sugar in its most concentrated form, as candies and sweets. They were also the most vulnerable to its adulterations. A child who ate penny sweets regularly was consuming whatever had been mixed into those sweets, including the toxic coloring agents and the mineral fillers. A child's smaller body could not process these substances as efficiently as an adult's, and the effects accumulated over time. The sugar problem was particularly insidious because sugar was so central to Victorian life. It was in everything. It sweetened tea and coffee and beer. It preserved fruits and made medicines palatable. It provided quick energy to bodies worn down by labor and malnutrition. The removal of sugar from the Victorian diet would have been unthinkable. And so the adulterations continued, and the bodies absorbed the toxins, and the harm accumulated invisibly over years and decades. Beyond the fixed shops and established trades, there existed a vast informal economy of street food sellers. Men and women who hawked their wares from carts and barrows, from trays carried on their heads, from baskets hung over their arms. These vendors served the poorest of the poor, the casual laborers and the unemployed, the homeless and the desperate, those who had no kitchens in which to prepare food and no money to buy from proper shops. The street food of Victorian London was a world unto itself. There were sellers of pies and puddings, of fried fish and roasted potatoes, of pickled whelks and boiled sheep's feet. There were coffee stalls and ginger beer vendors, sellers of hot eels and pea soup, of sandwiches and saveloys. For a penny or a halfpenny, a hungry person could buy something hot to eat, something to fill the stomach for another few hours. The quality of this food was, to put it mildly, variable. The meat pies that were sold on the streets were objects of particular suspicion. The filling of a penny pie was a mystery wrapped in pastry, and customers learned not to ask too many questions. The meat might be genuine of a sort, but it was often the worst cuts from the cheapest sources. Offal, gristle, and scraps that could not be sold any other way found their way into pie fillings. Meat that was beginning to spoil was heavily spiced to mask the taste and smell. There were persistent rumors, never quite proven, but never quite dispelled, that some pie fillings contained meat from sources that did not bear thinking about. Cats and dogs were mentioned. Rats were mentioned. These stories may have been urban legends, but they reflected a genuine anxiety about food whose origins could not be traced. The fat used to make the pastry was often rancid, recycled from previous cooking, collected from dubious sources. The pastry itself might be adulterated with alum or other substances to make it whiter and flakier. The finished product looked like a meat pie and tasted enough like a meat pie to satisfy a hungry customer. But what it actually contained was anyone's guess. Asterisk, asterisk, the fried fish sold on the streets was another staple of working-class diet. Fish and chips, that most English of meals, had its origins in the street food economy of the Victorian city. The fish was often genuine, though not always fresh. But the fat in which it was fried was reused again and again, growing darker and more rancid with each batch. This recycled fat contained compounds that modern science has identified as carcinogenic, though the Victorians had no such knowledge. The drinks sold by street vendors were equally suspect. Ginger beer was a popular refreshment, but the ginger beer sold on the streets was often made with artificial flavorings rather than real ginger, sweetened with saccharin or other substitutes, rather than sugar, and colored with various additives to give it the expected appearance. The bottles were reused without proper cleaning, and the product was sometimes contaminated with bacteria. Coffee stalls offered a warm drink to workers on their way to early morning shifts. But the coffee was often not coffee at all. Roasted chicory, roasted acorns, roasted carrots, even roasted sawdust were used to stretch the expensive coffee beans or to replace them entirely. The resulting drink was hot and brown and vaguely bitter, but it bore little resemblance to genuine coffee. The street food economy operated entirely outside any regulation or oversight. There were no licenses required, no inspections conducted, no standards enforced. Anyone with a cart and some capital could set up as a food seller, and there was nothing to prevent them from selling whatever they pleased at whatever prices the market would bear. For the customers, street food was often the only food available. A dock worker with an hour's break and tuppence in his pocket could not go home for a proper meal. A homeless child sleeping in doorways had no kitchen and no groceries. These were the people who ate what the streets offered, and they took their chances with every bite. The grocery shop was where most Victorian families bought the staples of their diet, the tea and sugar and flour and butter that sustained daily life. The grocer was a respectable tradesman, often a figure of some standing in his community, trusted to provide honest goods at fair prices. This trust was routinely betrayed. We have already spoken of the major commodities that were subject to adulteration: bread and milk, tea and sugar, sweets and beer. But the corruption of the Victorian food supply extended far beyond these well-known cases. Almost every product on the grocer's shelf was subject to some form of fraud. Butter was adulterated with water, with animal fats other than butterfat, with vegetable oils, and with coloring agents. The yellow color that consumers expected from good butter was often achieved through the addition of annatto, or, more dangerously, lead chromate. Rancid butter was treated with chemicals to mask the smell and mixed with fresh butter for sale. Cheese was similarly corrupted. Cheap cheese was colored to look like more expensive varieties. Foreign matter was added to increase weight. The rinds were sometimes treated with substances that made them look aged and venerable when they were actually young and tasteless. Flour has already been discussed in the context of bread, but flour sold for home baking was equally adulterated. The housewife who baked her own bread in hopes of avoiding the baker's frauds was often using flour that had already been stretched with chalk and alum and other substances. Pepper was one of the most commonly adulterated spices. It was expensive and in high demand, and it was easily stretched with ground nut shells, ground olive stones, dried bread crumbs, and floor sweepings. Some samples of pepper that were tested contained almost no actual pepper at all. Mustard was mixed with flour and colored with chrome yellow. Cayenne pepper was adulterated with red lead. Cinnamon was stretched with ground cassia bark, which was cheaper and inferior. Coffee was mixed with chicory, with roasted grains, with various other substances that were cheaper than coffee beans. Jam was a particular concern because it was often given to children. The fruit content of cheap jam was minimal, stretched with apple pulp, turnip pulp, or other cheap fillers. The color was enhanced with synthetic dyes, some of which were toxic. The seeds that gave the appearance of real fruit were sometimes added separately from a different source than the fruit itself. Vinegar was diluted with water and then strengthened with sulfuric acid to restore its acidity. Pickles were colored with copper compounds to make them greener. Preserved vegetables were treated with various chemicals to maintain their color and texture. The pattern was consistent across virtually every food category. Where there was profit to be made through adulteration, adulteration occurred. Where there was no oversight or regulation, fraud flourished. The grocer's shelf was a museum of deception, a collection of products that were not what they claimed to be, and the consumers who trusted those products were consistently betrayed. The human cost of Victorian food adulteration was measured most painfully in the children's wards of hospitals and in the burial records of parish churches. Children were the most vulnerable victims of the poisoned food supply, and they died in numbers that should have shocked the nation into action. That we have already noted the role of adulterated milk in infant mortality. But the dangers to children extended far beyond infancy. At every stage of childhood, the food supply posed threats that were invisible to parents and caregivers. The sweets the children loved were colored with lead and arsenic. The bread that sustained them was adulterated with substances that interfered with their nutrition. The milk they drank was contaminated with bacteria and diluted with polluted water. The tea that everyone drank, including children, was sometimes colored with toxic pigments. The effects of these exposures were cumulative and often slow to manifest. A child who ate penny sweets regularly over months and years was accumulating lead in her bones and tissues. A child who ate adulterated bread 3 times a day was being slowly malnourished even as his stomach was filled. A child who drank contaminated milk might survive the immediate infections, but suffer lasting damage to his digestive system. Asterisk, asterisk. The symptoms of chronic poisoning are not dramatic. They are not the sudden convulsions and collapse of acute poisoning. They are fatigue and weakness, digestive problems and failure to thrive, developmental delays and learning difficulties. Victorian physicians saw these symptoms constantly among the children of the poor, and they attributed them to the generally unhealthy conditions of urban life. They did not always connect the symptoms to the food dot when children did die acutely. From food poisoning, the deaths were often attributed to other causes. A child who died of convulsions after eating arsenical sweets might be recorded as dying of a fit. A child who died of gastric distress after drinking contaminated milk might be recorded as dying of cholera infantum or summer complaint. The connection to food was not always made, and even when it was made, it was often not acted upon. The Bradford sweet poisoning of 1858 was exceptional because it was so concentrated and so sudden. 21 deaths in a single weekend, all traceable to a single batch of candy, could not be ignored or explained away. But the slow, distributed deaths caused by routine food adulteration never made headlines, never prompted inquests, never led to prosecutions. How many children died from eating leaded sweets over the course of the Victorian era? How many infants perished from drinking adulterated milk? How many young lives were shortened by the accumulated effects of a poisoned food supply? These questions cannot be answered with precision. The deaths were not counted, the causes were not recorded, the victims were not named. We know only that they were many. We know that they were mostly poor. We know that they were mostly young. And we know that they died because profit was valued more than their lives. In the midst of this toxic darkness, there were those who tried to illuminate the truth. The most important of these crusaders was Arthur Hill Hazell, a physician and microscopist whose investigations exposed the scale of food adulteration and helped create the political will for reform. Hazell was born in 1817 and trained as a doctor, but his true passion was the microscope. He became expert in the examination of minute structures, publishing important works on the freshwater, algae of Britain, and developing techniques for identifying substances under magnification. In the early 1850s, Hazell was commissioned by The Lancet, the leading medical journal, to investigate the quality of food sold in London. What he found shocked even those who suspected the worst. Working systematically, Hazell purchased samples of food from shops across the city and subjected them to microscopic and chemical analysis. He examined bread and found it adulterated with alum and chalk. He examined milk and found it diluted with water and thickened with starch. He examined tea and found it mixed with used leaves and colored with toxic pigments. He examined coffee and found it stretched with chicory and various other substances. He examined pepper and found it bulked out with ground, husks, and floor sweepings. Hazell's reports were published in The Lancet between 1851 and 1854, and they created a sensation. Here was scientific proof of what consumers had long suspected but could not prove. Here were the names of specific products and specific vendors identified as selling adulterated goods. Here was evidence that the food supply of the greatest city in the world was thoroughly, systematically corrupted. The reports caused outrage among consumers and panic among traders. Some of the merchants named in Hazell's reports sued for libel, but they could not dispute his findings. The microscope did not lie. The chemical tests did not lie. The adulteration was real, and now it was documented. Hazell's work was meticulous and thorough. He tested hundreds of samples across dozens of food categories. He developed new techniques for detecting adulterants that were invisible to the naked eye. He trained other analysts in his methods, creating a cadre of experts who could continue the work of investigation. But Hazell understood that investigation alone was not enough. The problem was systemic, and it required a systemic solution. There needed to be laws against food adulteration, and there needed to be enforcement mechanisms to ensure those laws were obeyed. Hazell became an advocate for reform, testifying before Parliament, writing articles for the popular press, and building alliances with other reformers. His work helped lay the groundwork for the legislative changes that would eventually come. Though they came slowly and incompletely, the resistance to reform was formidable. The food trades had powerful economic interests at stake, and they lobbied hard against any regulation that might affect their profits. Many politicians were themselves connected to food businesses or received support from food traders. The ideology of laissez-faire, which held that the government should not interfere in the marketplace, was dominant among the ruling classes. But the evidence that Hazell and his colleagues had compiled was too damning to ignore entirely. The Bradford sweet poisoning in 1858 provided a dramatic illustration of the dangers that the reformers had been warning about. Public opinion began to shift, and Parliament was eventually forced to act. The first Adulteration of Food and Drink Act was passed in 1860, but it was weak and poorly enforced. A stronger act followed in 1872, and then the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875, which established a more effective framework for regulation. These laws were far from perfect, and enforcement remained patchy for many years. But they represented a fundamental shift in principle. The recognition that the state had a role in protecting consumers from poisoned food. Arthur Hill Hazell did not single-handedly reform the British food supply, but his work was essential in creating the conditions for reform. He brought scientific rigor to a problem that had previously been understood only through anecdote and suspicion. He named names and provided proof. He made it impossible for respectable society to pretend that the problem did not exist. The sale of food, and now Drugs Act of 1875 was, in many ways, a landmark achievement. It established the principle that food should be what it claimed to be, that selling adulterated products was a crime, and that the government had a responsibility to protect consumers. It created a framework for inspection and enforcement that, however imperfect, was far better than what had existed before. But for the countless victims who had already suffered and died, the law came too late. The children who had eaten arsenical sweets in the 1840s and 1850s were already dead or damaged. The infants who had died from contaminated milk in the great epidemic years of the 1860s were already in their graves. The working men who had drunk poisoned beer and eaten adulterated bread over decades had already paid the price and shortened lives and ruined health. The law could not bring them back. It could not compensate them for what they had suffered. It could only try to prevent the same harms from being inflicted on future generations. Even this limited goal was only partially achieved. The 1875 Act was better than its predecessors, but it still had significant weaknesses. Enforcement depended on local authorities, who varied widely in their commitment and competence. The penalties for adulteration were often too light to serve as effective deterrents. The definition of adulteration remained contested, with clever lawyers finding ways to defend practices that were clearly fraudulent. The food trades adapted to the new legal environment. Some practices were abandoned because they were now too risky. Others were modified to fall just outside the definition of illegal adulteration. New forms of fraud emerged to replace the old ones, but the trend was clearly in the direction of improvement. Over the decades that followed, food standards gradually rose. The most dangerous adulterants, the lead and arsenic and strychnine, largely disappeared from the food supply. The most egregious frauds became less common as enforcement improved and public awareness increased. By the end of the Victorian era, the food supply was significantly safer than it had been at mid-century. This was not because traders had become more honest, but because the risks of dishonesty had increased. The combination of legal penalties, public exposure, and consumer awareness made adulteration less profitable than it had once been. The legacy of the reform movement was institutionalized in the form of ongoing inspection and regulation. The principle that food safety was a government responsibility became firmly established. Future generations would build on this foundation, extending protections and improving enforcement. But the progress was slow, and the cost of delay was measured in human lives. Every year that passed without effective regulation was a year in which people continued to be poisoned by their food. The reformers had to fight against powerful interests and entrenched ideologies. And every step forward was hard-won. When we look back at the age of adulteration from the safety of our modern regulatory environment, it is tempting to feel superior, to congratulate ourselves on how far we have come. But we should remember how long it took for even basic protections to be established, and how many people suffered and died while the political process worked its slow course. The law came, but it came too late for too many. What lessons did the Victorians learn from the Age of Adulteration? What changed in the years that followed, and what remained the same? The most important lesson was that markets do not regulate themselves when it comes to food safety. Left to their own devices, traders will cut corners, adulterate products, and poison consumers. Not because they are uniquely evil, but because the economic incentives push in that direction. Competition drives prices down, and lower prices require lower costs, and lower costs are achieved through fraud. Without external regulation, the honest trader is punished and the dishonest trader is rewarded. This lesson, once learned, reshaped the relationship between government and the food industry. The laissez-faire ideology that had allowed the Age of Adulteration to flourish gave way, gradually and incompletely, to a recognition that public health required public action. Food safety became a legitimate function of government, a principle that is now so widely accepted that it seems obvious. The techniques of food adulteration evolved along with the yell, techniques of detection and regulation. The crude frauds of the mid-19th century, the chalk in bread and lead in sweets, became less common as they became more easily detected and more severely punished. But new forms of adulteration emerged, adapted to new technologies and new regulatory environments. But the fundamental tension between profit and safety did not disappear. It was managed, contained, regulated, but never eliminated. In every generation, there have been scandals that reveal how easily food safety can be compromised when vigilance lapses. The melamine in Chinese milk powder, the horse meat in European beef products, the E. coli in American spinach. All of these modern scandals echo the themes of the Victorian Age of Adulteration. The consumers who suffered most in the Victorian era were those who could least afford to protect themselves. The poor ate the worst food, the most adulterated, the most dangerous. They had no choice because that was what they could afford, and they had no information because there was no way for them to know what was in the products they bought. This pattern has not entirely disappeared. The relationship between poverty and food quality remains, even in modern regulated markets. Those with money can buy organic, can buy premium, can choose the products with the cleanest labels and the most transparent supply chains. Those without money buy what they can afford, and what they can afford is often what is cheapest. And what is cheapest is often what cuts the most corners. The children who died in the Victorian era were invisible because they were poor and young and numerous. Their deaths were not investigated. Their stories were not told. Their graves were unmarked. They disappeared into the statistics of infant mortality and childhood disease. Their individual sufferings submerged in the aggregate numbers. We have remembered them tonight. We have spoken of the sweets that poisoned them, and the milk that sickened them, and the bread that failed to nourish them. We have named the substances that damaged their small bodies, and the systems that allowed those substances to reach them. We have honored them in the only way we can, by telling the truth about what happened to them. Asterisk, the sweet shops are closed now. The gas lamps extinguished, the penny jars empty and gathering dust in museum collections. The Victorian age has passed into history, and with it, the worst excesses of the Age of Adulteration. We no longer fear that our bread contains bones, or that our tea has been colored with lead. We take for granted a level of food safety that would have seemed miraculous to our great-great-grandparents. But we should not forget, we should not forget the children who pressed their faces against the sweet shop glass, who handed over their precious pennies for candies colored with arsenic and lead. We should not forget the infants who died in their mother's arms, poisoned by milk that was meant to nourish them. We should not forget the working men and women who ate adulterated bread 3 times a day and wondered why they never felt strong. These were not faceless victims. They were individuals, each with a name, a family, a life that was cut short or diminished by the poisoned food supply. The records do not preserve their names for us. The parish registers list only cause of death, age, sometimes occupation, rarely anything that would help us know them as people. They have disappeared into the anonymity of history, remembered only as statistics, but they were real. They lived in the cramped streets of industrial cities, in the smoky rooms of tenement buildings, in the shadow of factories and workhouses. They worked long hours for little pay, and they came home to food that was slowly killing them. And they did not know, could not know, what was being done to them. Not we remember them tonight, not because their deaths were dramatic or because their stories were unusual, but precisely because they were ordinary. They were the everyday victims of a system that valued profit over human life, and their ordinariness is what makes their fate so troubling. The system that poisoned them was not the work of villains. It was the work of ordinary people making ordinary decisions within a structure that rewarded fraud and punished honesty. The baker who added alum to his bread was not trying to harm anyone. He was trying to stay in business. The milkman who watered his milk was not a murderer. He was a tradesman cutting corners like everyone else. The sweet maker who used toxic coloring was not thinking about the children who would eat his products. He was thinking about his costs and his competitors. The evil was systemic, not individual. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of all when we create systems that reward harmful behavior. Harmful behavior will occur. When we fail to regulate, when we trust the market to police itself, when we assume that competition will produce good outcomes, we create the conditions for exploitation and harm. The invisible hand does not protect consumers. It protects profits. The reforms that eventually came were the work of people who refused to accept the system as it was. Arthur Hill Hessel, with his microscope, exposing frauds that had been hidden for generations. Journalists who wrote about poisoned sweets and adulterated bread. Members of Parliament who pushed for legislation against fierce opposition. Ordinary citizens who demanded that their food be safe to eat. Change is possible. Systems can be reformed, but reform requires knowledge and organization and persistence. It requires people who are willing to speak the truth about what is happening and to fight for a better way. It requires remembering what happened when no one was watching, when no one was protecting, when no one was held accountable. So we remember the penny sweets in their bright-colored jars. We remember the baker's loaves, white with alum and heavy with chalk. We remember the milkman's cry in the early morning streets and the thin blue milk he ladled into waiting jugs. We remember the children's war in the hospital, the small, still bodies, the mother's grief. We remember, and in remembering, we honor those who suffered. We remember, and in remembering, we commit ourselves to vigilance. We remember, and in remembering, we refuse to let it happen again. The night is quiet now. The sweet shops are empty. The victims are at rest. Sleep well. and may your dreams be peaceful. Good night.